And hello, my fabulous students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I am excited to be with you today. We have a full slot here today. We have a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about European colonization in North America. There is so many pieces moving on the board. Who's going to become supreme? We're going to figure that all today. So let us go ahead and begin. All right, so we're going to talk about Spanish colonies first. So the Spanish have Florida for one thing. So Florida was claimed by Ponce de Leon in 1513 for Spain, and that's going to be the establishment of the first city, if you will, from Europeans at least, St. Augustine in Florida. And few settlements will happen in Florida due to little gold, disease, war, hurricanes blowing through there. Even today, it's a little dangerous weather-wise, but it. Some of these places, it was kind of rough getting a colony going. I mean, it was unfamiliar. There was disease ridden. They weren't used to the kind of weather, the terrain, the everything. Just plus, not to mention the natives who didn't like that they're encroaching on their land. So yeah, I mean, that's just, it wasn't all sunshine and roses for a lot of these Europeans. Many of them lost their lives in the process of trying to colonize, not to mention the Native Americans who also lost their lives in the conflict as well as disease as well. So you have New Mexico and Arizona. The Spain are going to take that place, take that over around 1610. Eventually, it'll be the Pueblo Revolt as a result of trying to push their ideals and religion on them to the point of frustration. You have Texas that will be colonized by Spain, and it's going to kind of be a buffer zone between the Mississippi, where the French are starting to also get a foothold in the Louisiana area and along the Mississippi, which we'll talk a little bit about them. And then you have California as well. San Diego will be a settlement by Spain, and that's going to be done because the Russians are starting to colonize parts of Alaska. So Spain was trying to get a footing on that side of the continent as well. And then the French here, most French are coming over for economic opportunities such as fur trading. Many men came over by themselves. They didn't come up bring over a wife because they weren't really planning on settling per se. They were coming over for economic turnover and then go back to France, right? So some of the men eventually married native women, and those native women could serve as guides, translators, negotiators, and helping them with those economic aspirations. You have Quebec becoming one of the first settlements of France in what's now Canada, and that's located on the St. Lawrence River. The Mississippi River in Louisiana is going to be a pretty strong foothold for the French for quite some time. And then you have New Orleans, which will be a permanent settlement in Louisiana. And it's going to be where the Mississippi River kind of dumps out into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a easily accessible and advantageous settlement for getting there by ocean, but then being able to take advantage of the Mississippi for further trade. You have the Dutch. So in 1609, you got Henry Hudson who's going to explore the what's now the Hudson River, and they're going to eventually found the land New Amsterdam, which will be later New York. The Dutch West India Company, a joint stock company, is going to manage that territory, and the Dutch settled there for trading opportunities. Very few intermarried with the native Indians, very similar to what the British will do as well. And then you got the British colonies coming in and covering all this orangey yellow color right here. Um, Again, joint stock companies were used to finance these risky enterprises of colonization because you have many people putting in money into the pot. So if there's a storm that wipes out a bunch of ships, then it's not too hard of a hit if many people sort of put it into the pot. Many governments couldn't finance such things as they're also worried about so many other domestic issues and foreign policy issues, potential enemies, etc. So it made a lot of sense to have these joint stock companies, and they were most frequent in Britain and in Holland. Um, so as a result, the British are slowly going to begin colonizing the east coast of North America. You have a high percentage of families and single females that are going to be coming over, and that's going to play a part because British aren't going to be so apt to intermarry with the natives, right? So so they're going to stick to their own. Um, However, they will try to create some kind of trades agreements and things like that with the natives. But a lot of settlers came from Britain because they're looking for a better life and religious freedom. So the first official English colony is Jamestown in 1607. This was founded by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company chartered by James the First. So it was hard when they first got there. People were unaccustomed to the swampy terrain of the James River. You had mostly gentlemen who were there, who didn't really know much about farming or anything, and then the men, wanted to come over for fortune. I mean, they keep hearing about all this gold and stuff, and so the men that did come over that weren't the gentlemen were there for just turning a quick buck or whatever. They refuse to hunt or farm or do anything that really requires settling. They want to just go out and find their fortune and head back home. So, a lot of different motives, if you will, with the Jamestown settlement. It's through the powerful leadership of John Smith that the colony survived for the first 5 years. John Rolfe, he's also going to be the man who will marry Pocahontas. So John Smith is the man who says that Pocahontas saved his life as a little girl from dying. However, John Smith's going to go back to England. Eventually, John Rolfe here, he's going to marry Pocahontas, and the two of them are going to make Jamestown very profitable by converting its land to selling tobacco. And all this area that they kind of create is going to eventually become known as Virginia. So, a group known as separatists are in England, and they are followers of the Protestant reformer John Calvin. So, as separatists, they really wanted King James to cut all ties with the Roman authority, the Roman Catholic authority. They felt like the Church of England's like rituals were too Catholic, and anyway, so their rising voices really made them seem like a threat to his power, James's power, King James. And so a lot of the separatists, because they weren't willing to sort of be quiet, were arrested and jailed. Many separatists at this point, with all the persecution, fled to Holland, and they became known as pilgrims because they were leaving um, over for Holland. But eventually, just things got bad in Holland, and there's just a cultural clash going on there. So the separatists left for new land that they keep hearing about in the Americas, hoping to sort of get that freedom, that religious freedom. So the Plymouth Colony is kind of the most famous for the pilgrims or the separatists, right? So in 1620, a small group of pilgrims sailed for Virginia on the Mayflower. They wanted to go to Virginia. Okay, less than half of the 100 passengers were separatists. The other men were looking for economic opportunity. So remember, it's these joint stock companies that are putting these things together here, and they were able to. They couldn't get all passengers who were separatists, and so separatists had to kind of share it with other people with different intentions. After a hard voyage of 65 days, the ship anchored off the Massachusetts coast, 600 miles north of Virginia. Rather than sail down to Virginia as planned, they just decided, hey, let's just start here and build our colony. We're here to establish ourselves and build a place where we can have religious freedom, and let's just start anew. So half of the settlers died that winter, just gone. Um, the American Indians had compassion on this small group of people and taught them how to sort of adapt to the land and how to harvest and how deep to put the seeds in the ground, how if it's too deep or too shallow. I mean, there's just so many. England is becoming more industrialized, so people in England aren't all versed in farming these days, right? So a lot of these people who move over, that they want freedom, but they're not completely prepared for what really was to come and what they need to do to survive. However, the first harvest that happened between the Pilgrims or the Separatists and the Native Americans was known as the First Thanksgiving. Strong leaders like William Bradford and Captain Miles Standish slowly grew the colony into like a fish, fur, lumber economy. Um, and then you have the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is a separate group of people who were also becoming popular in England, known as the Puritans. And they believed the Church of England needed to be reformed or purified. They thought that it was becoming too maybe corrupt isn't the right word, but it wasn't teaching the right ideals of the Bible that they felt it should have been teaching. The focus was on other things, maybe even power. Um, so persecution intensifies when Charles I took the throne in 1625. Again, we have another group like the Separatists who are seeking for religious freedom, and so they gained a royal charter for Massachusetts Bay Company. So in 1630, 1,000 Puritans led by John Winthrop sailed and founded Boston. This began a movement known as the Great Migration, not to be confused with the Great Migration much later in history as African Americans moved from the south to the north. Different, but still Great Migration. And this saw some 15,000 settlers in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630s, right? So Puritans began many settlements in Massachusetts and New York, relying economically on commerce and agriculture. So you got Massachusetts kind of blowing up here with the separatists, with the Puritans, and you got down in Virginia, the Jamestown, thriving as well. So what else happens? In 1632, part of Virginia was split off and created Maryland. So now we have a Catholic noble whose name's George Calvert. He is the first Lord Baltimore. He was commissioned by the king to govern a colony under his authority. After his death, his son Cecil Calvert, who's known as the second Lord Baltimore, Baltimore being the namesake of the capital of Maryland, which is today. So this guy carried out his father's vision of creating Maryland as a place of refuge for Catholics that were being persecuted by Protestants in England. Isn't this incredible, right? So you got Protestants being persecuted by Protestants, you got Catholics being persecuted by Protestants. Just really interesting stuff history is. So this started with the Act of Toleration. So Protestant farmers outnumbered Catholic farmers in Maryland. Thus, the Toleration Act was the first colonial statute to grant religious freedom, period. Okay, can't discriminate people due to their religion. Eventually, the acts were repealed, but this led to Maryland becoming the most religiously tolerant colony compared to Virginia. So Rhode Island emerges pretty much next. We have Roger Williams was a Puritan that believed that a person's conscience was beyond the control of any civil or church authority. This put him in conflict with the Puritan leaders. So get this, okay? So the Puritans leave because they're being persecuted and there's intolerance in England. So then they come over to America, right? And then they're happy and they have that religious freedom. However, they become so intolerant of other views that people are now fleeing from them. Uh, it's just astounding, right? Anyway, so you have Roger Williams, who's banished pretty much from Boston, and he flees southward, and he establishes the community of Providence, which will later become Providence, Rhode Island, right? Which is the capital today. So William started one of the first Baptist churches. The government in Providence allowed Catholics, Quakers, Jews to worship freely. So again, it's this attitude of constantly trying to expand the freedom of religion. We also have a gal named Anne Hutchinson who believed in antinomianism and the idea that salvation came from faith alone and not from following traditional moral laws. So she too conflicted with the Puritan leadership and she founded Portsmouth. So eventually, Portsmouth and Providence are going to join into a single colony to make Rhode Island. Because this colony tolerated diverse beliefs, it served as a refuge for many. So we have a few more in New England here. We have Connecticut, that was created by a reverend. His name was Thomas Hooker. And again, led a large group from Boston Puritans. Everyone's breaking off from these Puritans because they become too oppressive. I mean, they left oppression in England and they too became oppressive. Anyway, so we have Thomas Hooker is going to found Hartford, which obviously Hartford, Connecticut. The first written constitution in American history was created, known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So you have kind of like the first idea of a constitution where rights are expressly outlined in a charter of sorts. You have John Davenport in 1637 founded New Haven. Eventually, those two are going to connect together and join, and you're going to have Connecticut, right? And then in New Hampshire, which is the last colony in New England, King Charles II is going to separate New Hampshire from Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he's going to make it a royal colony, and then you have New Hampshire. So that kind of gives you an idea of New England. Let's jump to the Carolinas now. So South Carolina, um, these are colonists from England and planters from Barbados, which is an island in the Caribbean, founded by Charleston. Uh, king, the name of the king is Charles the First. Originally, the economy was based on trading furs and supplying provisions for West Indies. That was kind of what it was originally meant for. But they're going to eventually grow South Carolina into this massive, large rice growing plantation economy, and that's going to require a lot of enslaved Africans and also indentured servants. And they're going to make South Carolina look a lot like the West Indies, like in Haiti and other places where, 80% of the population at one point can become enslaved Africans. So in North Carolina, unlike South Carolina, we so North Carolina has not as good a harbors. The transportation isn't all that great there either. North Carolina is going to sort of draw a lot from Virginia in terms of their economy. They're going to start a tobacco farm type economy with the cash crop of tobacco. They're going to have indentured servants and enslaved Africans. Not as many, though, as like South Carolina. It's going to earn a reputation in 1700s for having democratic views and autonomy from British control. Now we're going to the Middle Colonies. A lot of colonies here. So King Charles the Second wished to consolidate the land holdings along the Atlantic coast and close the gap between New England and the Chesapeake colonies. This required the compelling the Dutch to give up New Amsterdam. So they're like, "Hey, it's time. Amsterdam is going to be ours." So they took it by force, but it was taken pretty easily by force because I mean the British were a lot more numerous because they were settling everywhere, and the Dutch had just this small little territory. So the king's going to take it. They're going to immediately name it New York because they don't want to keep any Dutch names around, right? The Dutch settlers were allowed religious freedom and could even speak their own language. They were under British control now. The king did not want representative assembly in New York. This was met with great opposition. Eventually, civil and political rights were granted. And now you have New Jersey coming into play here. So, this idea that New York territory is too big, James II didn't like that, so he splits it. And then it gets split again. So we eventually have West New Jersey and East New Jersey. And there's some difficulties that come with that. Many things is there's property line concerns, and the Quakers became very dominant in that region, and so that kind of threw off the balance of many things. Anyway, there's a lot going on, but eventually, just through mismanagement, the crown's going to take over, and they're going to combine the two jerseys together and make the official royal colony of New Jersey. So Pennsylvania becomes what's called the Holy Experiment. Sorry. So the crown, the British crown, gave a man named William Penn, who's a military and political leader, land in America for payment of a debt. Okay, so it's like, you know what, we owe you. Here's a bunch of land. So after his death, his son, also named William Penn, he joined the Christian group called the Religious Society of Friends, or the Quakers. So there's this massive land. The man who's been given it, he dies. They call it originally Penn's Woods, and then it gets changed to Pennsylvania. Now it's his son that kind of creates the vision for Pennsylvania, however, because of his affiliation with the Quakers. Penn hoped his colony would provide religious refuge for Quakers in England and other persecuted groups. He provided a frame of government, guaranteeing representative assembly elected by landowners and a written constitution, the Charter of Liberties. The charter guaranteed freedoms of religion and unrestricted immigration. Penn personally even crossed the Atlantic to see the founding of Pennsylvania on the Delaware River. He created a grid pattern for streets that was used in many cities afterwards. Many immigrants came to Pennsylvania for the freedom sanction there. And this is the second William Penn right here. All right, now we're on to Georgia. So Georgia's the last mainland colony, and just before I talk about Georgia, Delaware is also a 13th colony. And so what happened, Pennsylvania, in like the three counties in the southern part of Pennsylvania, they kind of break off and form Delaware. Even though Delaware was kind of governed by the same governor as Pennsylvania up until after the Revolutionary War, but Delaware does become its own unique territory. And then you have Georgia. So Georgia is interesting because it's directly financed by the British Crown. And one of the main reasons that they wanted this land of Georgia, they wanted a defensive barrier between Florida and South Carolina to protect their interests. They also wanted a place where they could send the overcrowding prisoners in the prisons in England. They wanted to relieve that prison system, and they wanted a territory where they could send these convicts, and they could also have these convicts have a chance to start over, start anew, start afresh, right? So, given a royal charter for a propriety colony, James Oglethorpe, he founded um, Savannah in 1733. Now, there are strict regulations. He had a vision where he wanted just sort of like a very moral colony. He banned drinking of rum. He banned slavery. Um, However, this colony was constantly under threat of being attacked and through skirmishes of Spain. So, not a whole lot of people wanted to move to Georgia because, there was this constant threat of being attacked. Um, so it didn't really prosper very well, and eventually the whole thing is going to be taken over by the British government. Restrictions on rum and slavery are going to be dropped. They adopted the South Carolina business model of just creating these massive plantations and having enslaved Africans to work them, and even indentured servants. Early political institutions. These are some things you need to understand. So, one of the first early political institutions in the Americas, Representative Assembly in Virginia, guaranteed to settlers the same rights as residents of England. So, people who came over to Virginia were guaranteed that same kind of right, including the representation in lawmaking. Eventually, the first representative assembly was organized into the House of Burgesses. Now, in New England, the people of the Mayflower before they even got off, so the separatists who docked in Massachusetts and didn't go 600 miles south down to Virginia, they docked, and before they even left the ship, they decided and they pledged that they would have the Mayflower Compact, and they wanted it to be done by the will of the majority. So whatever the will of the majority was, so it wasn't done by one dictator or anything. It was a democracy in essence, right? So despite these advances in freedom, we have landless men and women who had few rights. We have indentured servants who had practically no rights, and we had enslaved people who had none at all. So um, Thus, well, so there are a lot of democratic ideas that happened, right? However, there are also a lot of anti-democratic practices like slavery and the mistreatment of Native Americans that also occurred. So, I mean, it's not a perfect process. Uh, America was still trying to learn a lot of who they're going to be, and they're going to continue to do that. They're going to continue to bump their head and make bad choices, and they're going to continue to make good choices going forward as well. So go ahead and write that summary, and I look forward to talking about this to you when we return. Thanks.